All right, everybody, welcome back to Classical Fundamentals, Bending and Stelling. Now, this is part of the Classical Fundamentals series and is done intentionally right after Turn on the Forehand. Now, I thought about putting this before the Turn on the Forehand because it is still applicable for that particular movement, but I wanted you guys to start thinking about protolateral movements, and I wanted to make sure that you have a picture in your brain of kind of like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about bend. Now, in dressage, bend is talked about a lot. Stelling is not talked about as much as it should be. It used to be a big thing in dressage for a long time, but it just kind of came out of popularity as a subject to talk about and to study. So Stelling is, well, let's get to the next slide. What is bending and Stelling? Bending is the lateral side-to-side bend of the spine. So the horse turns his head side to side, or the tail side to side, or bends the whole body side to side. Stelling is the skull and how it relates to the position of the spine. So that could be side to side, up and down, forward and back, or tilting side to side. Tilting is not something that we necessarily want. They do that. They do that to try to look cute sometimes, to try to appease us into giving them a treat. Tilting can be a sign of a neurological issue, however, and it can also be an indicator of pain in certain parts of the neck or spine. And it can also be in completely blind horses. So this is 100% blind. They don't have any kind of sight that they can rely on. So such as the horses that have both eyes removed, for example, you will see their head tilt quite a bit to listen to wherever sounds or stimulus might come from. So you'll definitely be able to tell whether or not a horse is completely blind by whether or not they tilt their head to try to listen for something coming. Why is this all important? Knowing the degree of bend in all areas of the spine is extremely important for training and advocating for the welfare of the horse. So I say advocating for the welfare of the horse because if you know what is appropriate bend and what is overbent, then you can say as an onlooker, hey, this doesn't look right, and this is too of an extreme position for the horse's head to be in, especially if it is held in that position. Knowing how the skull is supposed to be in relation to the body and spine is very important to support proper biomechanics and kinesiology. So I know those are long words. So biomechanics is how the body is supposed to move. Ergonomics is the ease of movement, and kinesiology is the study of movement. So equine kinesiology is the study of the movement of the horse. So studying the movement and biomechanics and knowing the ergonomics of the horse is extremely important as a trainer and even an instructor, because if you are instructing somebody how to ride a horse, knowing the ergonomics of the horse and how the rider relates to that, and even more, knowing the ergonomics of the rider. And you can even go further than that and into para-dressage, where the ergonomics of the rider shifts and changes depending on the disability of that rider. So knowing all of that is extremely important as a trainer and instructor of whatever degree, because knowing if the horse is moving in a correct way or an incorrect way will prevent you from injuring the horse or injuring yourself for that matter. And I'm talking about long-term injuries. So long-term injuries such as low back pain for the rider. If you are not in an ergonomically positive position, then you will eventually have some back pain. Apparently 80% of dressage riders, like professional dressage riders, suffer from back pain over the time of their career, which is actually rather interesting. And then, of course, there are issues with the horse. So if the horse has bad posture, there can be sway back, there can be problems in the hips, there can be a roach back that can happen when it's called a sprung pelvis. So those are very extreme examples, but that does happen quite a bit. So how to perform bending and stelling. Now, if you hang around to the end of the video, I will show you the video of Revan performing the bending and stelling. And this is actually something that you can do it at home passively. So a passive bending and stelling is basically a stretch. So you are assisting your horse in a stretch. So if you know how to passively stretch, so if you are lying on the floor and then you bring your hips around and you face the other direction, you are passively stretching out your back muscles, for instance. So you are not engaging any muscles in order to stretch another group of muscles. An active stretch is when you are engaging one group of muscles to stretch another group of muscles. So they do that when they are scratching themselves. So they are actually actively stretching one part of their body while it's trying to scratch another part of their body. And that does happen. So to perform a passive bending and stelling, you find neutral spine position for your horse, and this can be very revealing because some horses that are not straight, their neutral spine will be curved, and they will be curved towards their stiffer side. So they curve, yeah. The side that the longer muscles have shortened, if that's the case in that horse. So you can actually, if you look down the middle of their ears with their head level and you look down their spine and see, okay, do they walk this way? Maybe lead them forward with their head down like that and watch their spine lead forward and back. Do they go out one way or the other? Do they have a tendency of drifting? So those are very revealing things, and those are things that you can note if you're going to have a body worker out or a veterinarian for a lameness exam. Those are things that you should notate down and let them know about. They tend to be very thankful for your insight. But you find a neutral spine position. So for Revan in this picture, this is his neutral spine. His head will be carried this way, and his head hangs almost on the vertical because we have been doing this from this picture 4 years. This was this past summer. So he has a very loose pull, and he very easily puts himself onto the vertical whenever he's doing any kind of work of any kind, basically. The next thing is try to keep the horse at the same quote vertical and look to one side. So I'm saying quote vertical because I'm not saying put him on the vertical. I'm saying wherever his neutral head is, when you found neutral spine, try to keep his head at that same level and then have him look one direction like I am doing with Revan. I'm not asking for extreme bend. I'm asking for those first two vertebrae and right where they connect with his skull. I want that to kind of stretch. So I am very gently manipulating his head to that direction. Now note, if the horse is having trouble or experiencing a muscle spasm, so if they start twitching, or if they just have a lot of resistance doing it, there may be a lot of muscle tension in their neck, preventing them from actually doing it. So try to be very privy to that as well. And here's the other direction. So that's what that looks like. So I'm just guiding him. I have my hand on the no-shay strap to kind of guide his jowl to that direction as well. And if he releases his jaw, that's okay. Ideally, what I want him to do is when he does this bend, that he releases his jaw and his jaw goes one way and his skull goes not quite the other way, but kind of the other way. So That's ideally a sort of a jaw release. So that's why I'm allowing him to be very relaxed. Right now he's got his eyes closed. So when you go back to straight spine, try gently pushing your horse's head onto the actual vertical and slightly up to stretch the pull muscles. So you're putting their nose in and then pushing their head slightly up. You're trying to get them to do sort of a neck cat stretch. So you're trying to get them to lift their head up whilst keeping the nose on the vertical. Do not put them behind the vertical, and do not teach them that behind the vertical is something that you want to have. That would be a very bad habit. It is not very ergonomic to be behind the vertical. I know horses swing their head behind the vertical once in a while, but to hold themselves there is a very ergonomically bad, basically. If your horse has resistance to this, it may be a flexibility issue. So they may not be just having, naughty issues, or they just don't want to do it. Maybe they are having some pain. Because if you think about it, if you try to go and stretch your hamstrings, for many of you, if you haven't really paid attention to that, it's going to be a bit stiff. And if you try to touch your toes, and if you try to force it, there's going to be more and more pain associated with that. So try to be very careful with this. Now bring his head down, keeping their head on the vertical, and just bring the nose roughly to the point of the knee. And that's where you want, and I'm showing you this in this picture, this is where you want their head for stretching forward down. So at the walk, at the trot, and at the canter. So when you do the stretchy trot, when judges say, hey, I want the nose a little bit more forward on the vertical, and I want them to be stretching forward, this is what they're talking about. And it can even be a little bit more forward of the vertical. I wouldn't mind being more forward of the vertical. But for this passive stretching, you want to show the horse that you can move their head up and down on the sliding vertical. Yep. Keeping on or in front of the vertical allows the nuchal ligament to stay on top of the spine. So there's this ligament that goes right from their skull and all the way down their back, and it's this ligament that helps keep the spine stable. And when you go behind the vertical and they are held behind the vertical, that nuchal ligament slides violently to the side and on top of one of the wings of the spine. And this usually happens right around the second vertebra, and it's very painful for them. And you don't want to be stretching that nuchal ligament out too far. That is something that must stay a reasonable length. So having a nuchal ligament that is too stretchy, it will not function properly. So the roll cur position or the LDR position forces that nuchal ligament to slide over to the side, and it will cause a lot of damage. So we don't want that. Active bending happens during turns, curves, circles, and lateral work. So actual bend. So we've been talking about stelling, which is the position of the head. Now we're talking about actual bend, so bend of the entire horse. Using the passive bending, before asking for active bend, make sure the horse is capable of said degree of bend. So before you're going to ask for the horse to bend one way or the other, you want to make sure that they can actually physically do it at a standstill before you try to get them to do it in motion. Now this is different than understanding that they don't have good range of motion and using motion as sort of a ballistic type stretch. That's different, but this is just establishing how flexible the horse is to begin with. It is okay to allow the horse to bring himself to neutral spine after a bend, especially if bending is something new. So Revan here has brought his head back to neutral spine, and it's a little bit farther up than it was before, and that's okay. So if you kind of see, if he lowers his head like a hinge, his skull will come back to the vertical, or very close to the vertical, like it was in the first slide of his picture. So right now he's listening to something behind him, so he just kind of raises his head up a little bit. And the best thing to do is many reps with many breaks. So you don't want to do just 1 or 2 long, heavy stretches that can be pretty painful. The muscle will take longer to recover from that, because any kind of stretching it pulls the muscle apart just the same as if you were to do weightlifting reps. So the muscle still has to recover and heal from that. So many reps, with many breaks is something important. So that's why you want to involve any kind of bending work every time that you work with your horse. So the most flexible areas of the horse's spine is the cervical, which is the neck, and the tail. So the tail is pretty flexible. It swishes around, it can curl, The neck is very flexible because they need to be able to bring their face around and scratch certain parts of their body. And so they can do a lot with their neck, and they can overbend themselves just to try to reach some spot on themselves or scratch something. And that's okay, but we don't want to be working in an overbent state, because if you notice, the horse will unbend itself when it wants to move forward, and it will generally move forward in a straight line. The thoracic spine is less flexible. So the thoracic spine is right at the base of the neck, and it will go into a little bit beyond the last rib. So that's the part of the spine that is carrying us. So that part of the spine is less flexible than the first 2 parts, but it is still somewhat flexible. The sacral spine, I can't go back. So let's talk about the lumbar. So the lumbar spine is barely mobile. It goes kind of side to side a little bit, but it has these wings that definitely, if you overbend that pelvis area to one side or the other, those wings will start touching each other and cause a lot of pain. There was an actual case. Bex Nairn actually dissected this one, where this horse was so compressed as a youngster, because youngsters' bones before the age of 5.5, 6 years old, a number of their bones are still very cartilagey, especially their spine, because their spine is the last to harden. And this was a racehorse, so the horse was being raced, and that part of the spine was being compressed quite a bit because of the starts. That's a lot of weight and a lot of force behind that launch forward. So I think it had a congenital issue on top of that, but those wings started fusing together and causing a lot of pain, and the horse had to get put down by, I think, age 4 or something. So that is very important. I cannot stress any more the importance to wait until the horse is an appropriate age to start really training. The sacral spine is fused and immobile, so it is actually fused together. It is not mobile. You can actually take it and stand on it, and it won't move. I think the biggest thing that makes, but the biggest part of it that's flexible, and it's not really the sacral spine, it's where it meets with the lumbar spine. You have this SI joint, and that is mobile. So that is something that can actually come apart, and that's called having a sprung pelvis, and that is not good. But knowing this, which I went into this kind of abruptly. But knowing this, this is the basis of knowing the degree of bend you need to have in any kind of lateral movement. So the degree of arc bending movements needs to be somewhat shallow to allow a reasonable evenness of bend throughout the body. So if you can see from the top view, this is a horse with the spine and the muscles with the fascia on top, and then of course just the horse with the skin. You can see how that lumbar spine changes. So you can see the thoracic, which have all of the ribs attached to it, and then right behind it's that lumbar spine. And of course right in the pelvic area is that sacral spine, which is fused. And you can see why it would be fused, because it's supposed to stabilize the pelvis. So if you could see, the degree of bend will have to be very shallow in that pelvic and lumbar area, and then it should continue on a shallow arc to all the way up to the skull. So that's why in the turn on the forehand, the maximum degree of bend that you should have in the horse's head is only in relation to the tip of that shoulder, like I show in that video. So yeah. And if you have any part of a spine that is then bending farther than that nice arc that is created from the pelvis all the way up to the head, that is called overbending. So if you overbend the neck and it becomes kind of a kink, and then it's called the shoulder is falling out, that means that there's a kink right at the shoulder, right where the cervical spine meets the thoracic spine, and the horse will then lose balance. So this is why you have to pay good attention to the degree of arc or bend throughout the body. And that's what I just mentioned. So the skull also needs to be in a lateral turn and not tilting to one side. So if you see a horse tilting its head, and this is at any level at any time, that is a fault. So there's an issue there that the rider or trainer are going to have to address. But the horse's head should be upright with the rest of his body. So here is some active bending and stelling. So I'm keeping his head upright in relation to the ground and his body, so perpendicular to the ground, as I bend to one side and then the other, trying to keep his head straight and not tilted. And then I will ask him to lower his head after the extra bend. And this is something that you can do at the beginning of any session, just to kind of get a read on how their flexibility is doing. But thank you for watching, and please check out our Patreon, and thank you patrons for supporting this channel, and have a wonderful day.